Welcome back to the post-lunch session. I know it's difficult to sit post-lunch, but I promise you the papers are great and exciting, so please do pay attention. I'm sure there'll be very interesting conversations today, and I look forward to the Q&A at the end of the session. We have about 12 minutes per panelist. Rasha is keeping time here, so she will let you know when it's time. We'll just get into it straight away so that you can have more time, and I'll sum up in the end. We'll start with Meghal Perera, who's from the Colombo Research Urban Lab.
Hi everyone, my name is Meghal, and I realize perhaps talking about cooking is not the best thing just after lunch, but that's the lens I'll be using to really talk about Sri Lanka's energy crisis and how women and urban women in particular responded to this new regime of constant energy disruption. So disruption in services and infrastructure of the global south in cities is nothing new. But I think that the scale, duration, and intensity of the Sri Lankan crisis make it quite exceptional. So obviously there are, the global energy crisis means that energy prices have increased everywhere. But in Sri Lanka, a shortage of foreign reserves has meant that Sri Lanka is unable to import a lot of energy sources. And this results in really unequal and erratic supplies of energy. And basically, so it's not just a story about rising prices, but it's a story of a completely dynamic energy landscape. And this landscape can change at a rapid pace. So for instance, if there are 2 days of heavy rain or a sudden extension of an Indian credit line, these factors suddenly reconfigure the availability and affordability of energy sources and different types of energy sources. So the point I want to make is that even though for the last year we have really been in a situation of prolonged breakdown in terms of energy, this breakdown is not passive. It's rather this dynamic regime where energy sources are contracting and fluctuating over time. So what does this mean on the ground? Basically, this flux is experienced in a lot of ways, obviously through fluctuating prices, but also daily power cuts that can range from 1 hour to 5 hours. At the height of the situation in February, there were 13-hour power cuts. And it's really been defined by images like this of queues, right? I'm sure many of you have seen these images in newspapers. And just to give you a sense of what it's like, so there's a huge shortage of LPG gas cylinders, and you might go for months without gas, and suddenly in the middle of the night, a gas truck will turn up. Everybody will have to flock and queue for it. You might not get gas after standing for hours, if not days. And there's also these dynamics within communities that determine how gas is distributed. And these queues often have their own cultures as well. So the picture on the right-hand side is of a kerosene queue. And as you can see, the caps of the kerosene canisters have been removed. This is so that people can leave the queue without fear of the canister being stolen, because the canister is quite worthless without the cap, right? So these are the kind of adaptations that people are doing every day. So regardless of the macroeconomic chaos and political instability outside the home, inside the home, the expectation of a woman to provide a nutritious and home-cooked meal has never changed, even at the worst of the crisis, right? Cooking is a routine and mundane labor, but it's essential for survival. And it's also very susceptible to these energy fluctuations, right? But at the same time, the gendered nature of this work means that it's often rendered invisible, especially from narratives of urban life. I want to point out that urban women, especially those in low-income categories in Sri Lanka, are the most time-poor populations as well. So I think by examining cooking fuel, we can explore how the energy crisis provokes different responses and improvisations by women. Now, this paper draws from fieldwork undertaken for the majority of last year, and this is part of the Living Off-Grid Food and Infrastructure Collaboration, which is a 5-city study. Colombo is one of the sites. Actually, Bangalore is another one of the sites. And the data is interviews conducted with 20 households, usually with the woman responsible for cooking. But in some cases, there were multiple people present at the time. The interviews take place across 2 sites. So the first is Sivalipura, which you see here, and this is known as a vatta or a tenement garden. This settlement underwent some upgrading in the 1980s. And as you can see, there's a lot of individuality in how people take care of their houses, which are usually on two-perch property slots. The second site is just 10 minutes away, and this is Sirasara Uyana, which is a high-rise complex where people from Vattas have been relocated under the Colombo Urban Regeneration Program. So very different typology, as you can see. This is one of about 3 buildings that form the complex, and they're all this kind of 12-story building. So in the context of energy flux and precarity, households have adopted fuel stacking, where they use multiple fuels at the same time, and this gives them resilience to the sudden shocks and fluctuations that the energy system is delivering to them. Some people actually have as many as 4 methods of cooking that they use simultaneously, depending on the supply of fuels. And this often requires an investment on their part of buying something maybe like a kerosene rice cooker, or you have this really innovative coconut shell charcoal stove that has also come out through the crisis. The ability to stack fuels is determined by things like income, by social networks and capital, but it's also shaped by housing typologies and histories. As Petrova and Phillips note in their 2021 article about South Africa, energy precarity is shaped as much by inflexible material infrastructures as by uncertain and flexible incomes. So I'm interested in how material objects such as gas cylinders, kerosene bottles, and stacks of firewood work within these different types of housing typologies, and how this influences fuel choices that women are making. Yeah, so this is 77% of urban Sri Lanka has relied on LPG gas cylinders. As you can see, this is a 5-kilo cylinder that's commonly used by our respondents. It's a little cheaper than the 12.5 kg one. And it's obviously, if you look at the materiality of this object, it's a closed, opaque system, and you can't really tamper with it without serious harm to yourself in some instances. And that's exactly what happened in the last, what happened in the last 2 months of 2021, where there were, over the course of 2 months, 730 gas explosions throughout the country. This was due to a change in the gas, allegedly due to a change in the gas composition. But this was also when the crisis and fuel shortages and gas shortages were just starting. So LPG gas went from something that was safe and reliable and widely used to something that was unavailable, expensive, and now also deadly. So faced in this situation, and there was also no way of knowing whether your cylinder was defunct, right? Some people resorted to these hacks where they would put liquid soap around the regulator to see if they could see if there was a leak, but these were really kind of acts of faith, as they themselves acknowledged. And many people just gave up on gas because it was just too risky to use. Another thing about gas is that you just can't predict when it's going to run out, and you also have no idea how much gas you've used. This might be inconvenient at the best of times, but in a situation where your gas truck might not arrive for 2 months, it really adds another layer of uncertainty to people's already pretty precarious lives. You can contrast that with something like kerosene, which is bought directly from the shed in plastic glass bottles. And you can, because it's transparent, you can very easily track it over time and track how many bottles you're using. So there's a level of control that this fuel gives as well. But no fuel is perfect. Kerosene was also in short supply because it's imported. And there was a 5-liter quota imposed. So that meant that women who were cooking with kerosene had to go to the petrol shed and stand in queues for multiple times as well, right? As a result, many women in Sivalipura switched to using firewood and really went back to, it was almost a regression of them going back to the cooking method that their mothers had used in the 80s and 70s. Despite the fact that cooking with wood fire is quite taxing, there's a lot of smoke involved, it's quite well documented, right, how difficult it is to cook with. For them, it was worth the time they saved standing endlessly in queues, which might not even offer a possibility of fuel at the end. This is particularly so for working women and those with small children. The other important thing about Sivalipura, which is the first site that I talked about, is that it was a beneficiary of participatory planning approaches in the 1980s. And under this program in the 1980s called the 1 Million Houses program, low-cost housing was delivered to people, and this sort of housing was more in tune with the rhythms of everyday life. People planned their own houses, they designed their own houses, and the main rule they had to stick to was that the smoke from one kitchen should not inconvenience neighbors. As a result, many houses actually had chimneys, and these chimneys suddenly got a renewed life last year when people began cooking with wood again. Even when they had altered their chimneys, as you can see in this image, there is space between the boundary wall and the house for small wood stoves. But not everybody benefited from these upgrading efforts, and in this photo you see some houses that do not have the tenure that came with the upgrading program. They came at a different time, and they've been broken down last year, and their inhabitants have been evicted. As you can see, there are more secure neighbors now forage for firewood in the debris of their house, and they enjoy a temporary windfall of free fuel. And there's this really sad situation where people are using the firewood from their neighbors' houses. And those people who are evicted often end up in high-rise buildings like the one I showed earlier. Here, wood fire is very unsafe, and it actually, in a neighboring complex, there was a fire that broke out in the 10th store because people used wood stoves. And what I want to say about this type of housing typology under the Colombo Urban Regeneration Program was that it really promised to usher families into this new system of modernity and a new way of life, right? But unfortunately, this modernity was really at odds with the disruptions that would happen. There was no room for disruption in this imagined idea of what the city would be like, and they had few options at their disposal. They would often pay a significant markup on kerosene and gas. They often ended up cooking in the electric rice cooker, as you can see here. This was extremely time-consuming. It sometimes took 5 hours of a woman's day to get a rice and curry meal. And when electricity tariffs increased by 75% in August, people actually were hit with massive bills. So they just basically, that meant cooking fewer meals, fewer dishes, and fewer vegetables. I want to end by saying that people didn't make this with resignation, right? People have actually said that they plan on having wood stoves even in a high-rise building if the situation doesn't improve. And I think that I want to end by saying that this shows that this is last resort in an uncertain future. I think that these responses to crises aren't standardized. They represent delicate balances of time and labor and risk, but they are determined by materialities and housing typologies. And these housing typologies and histories are the result of certain development trajectories that really show no interest in the everyday lives of people. So despite the indifference of the state, people are still making do, improvising, and finding solutions to problems they played no part in creating. Thank you.
Thanks, Meghal. Thanks for that wonderful presentation. I feel like for me, the 2 points that really stood out was this idea of fluctuation even within prolonged breakdowns, the idea that availability and prices both equally impact people. And I'll just probably put out a question there which you can answer later when we take Q&A, but a little bit if you could talk to us about the methods that you use, because we've had a previous conversation on the many complications of kind of doing this kind of research when people are standing in lines and, just the difficulty in reaching out to people. So perhaps that's something you can pick up in the end. We'll move to Sheila Mishra, who's online. Sheila, can you hear us?
Hello? Yeah.
So you have 12 minutes, and please keep an eye on the chat window because that's where they'll let you know that how many
Sure.
people have in the end. Great, thanks.
Fair enough, thank you. So is my screen visible?
Yeah.
So hello everyone. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity of presenting my paper in this conference. And the topic that I'll be presenting today is long way to go before they sleep, unraveling commutation time for in India's context using time use survey. My name is Chitra Mishra and I'm a research scholar in the Department of Economic Sciences at IIT Kanpur. So So, if we talk about migration and commutation, we would know that historically, migration of people for work has been a phenomena that has has been accompanied with the structural transformation of economies, and has actually paved the way for the release of surplus labor from the sectors that are low in productivity to the sectors that enjoy high productivity. So these are the visuals from migration and the commutation that we experience in our daily lives. Now, if you talk about the background and the motivation for the study, India in the recent past has experienced an unprecedented decline in the absolute number of workers, and it has also faced a stubbornly low and declining level of labor force participation rate of Indian women as well. So, and if we talk about the migration pattern, we would find that from Economic Survey of India that India is increasingly on the move, and so are Indians, which is primarily on account of out-migration or interstate or inter-district movement, and which is totally not impeded by the lingua franca, or which means the language. So, language is not a barrier in India's context when we talk about migration. And there has also been an unprecedented surge in labor mobility in India, which is evident from the doubling of internal migrants in the 2000s relative to the 1990s. An interesting feature of this migration pattern has been the market shift in the distribution of females, which is much more than a shift for males. And this has been borrowed from Economic Survey of India 2018. However, along with this long-term type of migration, there is another category, which is the short-term migration or the commutation pattern. They are also called overnighters in the literature, in which a person basically commutes frequently to a distant place and returns the same day. So with this background, the objective for my study is to advance the knowledge and commutation in a developing country like India by employing India's Pan-India Time Use Survey 2019, which was conducted by National Statistical Office, and to shed light on the gender dynamics of the commutation pattern in India's context. We would also be commenting upon the family characteristics and the individual characteristics that impact the commutation behavior of people in Indian context. So the limitation of the study is that the Time Use Survey does not provide any data on the distance or the cost of travel for commutation. Now, if we talk about the findings from the study, we find that the commutation for work in India's context is a gendered phenomena where women spend relatively less time than their male counterparts on commutation for work. Moreover, we also find that marriage acts as a penalty for women in India's context, where married women spend statistically less time on commutation than their single counterparts. Moreover, we also find that the urban areas do matter for women. That is, women in urban areas spend relatively more time on commutation than their rural counterparts. In contrast with the literature, we also find that employers and the own account workers spend statistically significant more time on commutation. In the context of other countries, we would find that these employers or the own account workers find it convenient, or there are less spatial friction when it comes to their commutation for work. So these are the findings, and we also find that commutation for work is facilitated by a dynamic caste-based network where the upper caste, where the people belonging to the socially advantaged categories spend statistically significant more time on commutation for work. Now, if you talk about the literature that we have reviewed so far, we find that the literature that has examined the commutation has found several factors that might impact the commutation, which ranges from the income status, the quality of the home, education status of the person, the male gender, nature of employment, the distance of work trips, mode of transportation, among other variables. However, literature is still obscure on the competing justifications. So a study done in the Indian context by Yadav et al. In 1991 used 3 years of prospective survey from 3 different types of villages to study the commutation and total mobility. However, the study didn't incorporate the gender dimension and was constrained by its sample size. Moreover, another study done by Sridhar and Aika noted that there is a lack of adequate research on commutation time in the Indian context, and the reason behind stating that was the dearth in the nationally representative data set. So Another study by Rushke and Houston observed that Lee and McDonald's and Rosenthal and Strange are the only studies to identify the commutes of the self-employed in relation to gender. Moreover, there's still divided empirical evidence on whether commuting causes utility or disutility. Now, in this slide, we have summarized the findings from the literature. Primarily, we find that commutation for some people acts as a utility and for some it acts as a disutility. Moreover, if we talk about the factors that impact the mobility, we would find that the patriarchal power relationships or the gender or the household responsibility hypothesis, or probably the reason ranging from the childcare or the type of unpaid work that the partners do have a bearing on the commutation of people. Moreover, if we talk about the demand side of the factors that might impact the commutation pattern, we see that the characteristics related to the workspace or the demand from the job market, whether it is on education ground or the gender wage gap. So these factors also impact the commutation for women, commutation for people. And if we talk about the jobs that people do and the commutation pattern that we observe, there's also a difference in the employees and the self-employed person. Moreover, there are some inherent features of an individual also that might impact their commutation pattern, like their attitude or the taste or the kind of transportation they have, and the region that they reside in, or their age or the race and ethnicity, among other factors. So, the contribution of the present study is that we now have pan-India time use survey, which was collected by National Statistical Office, and it is a nationally representative data set. So we would be exploiting this data set for our study to understand the commutation pattern in India's context. So, and we would also be contributing to the literature on this gendered phenomena of commutation. Moreover, if we talk about the data set that we have followed in our study, so this time use survey was conducted from January 2019 to December 2019. The question that was the question that was asked in time use survey 2019 was, what did the people did in the last 24 hours? So from 4 a.m. on the day before of the interview to the 4 a.m. on the day of the interview, what did people do? And their activities was divided into 30 minutes of time slot. And their activities were actually categorized on the basis of IIHS. So, the survey covered the time use of people aged six and above, and the sample size that we have considered in our study is around 1,21,003 individuals, where male are 96,135 and female are 24,832. An interesting feature of this time use survey is that it also considers transgender, but we have not included transgenders in our study. Moreover, we just focus on the travel and the commutation pattern code number 181 and 182. So we would be only looking at these two activities and how people spend their time on these two activities, which are code number 182, which stands for employment related to travel, and the 182 commuting. And a trivia of time use survey is that the earliest time use survey in India dates back to 1976-77, when Devaki Jain and Malini Chand collected data from 6 villages in Rajasthan and West Bengal. So the methodology that we have adopted in our paper is here we will be performing the OLS regression, where the dependent variable is the time spent by the IF individual on commutation, which is basically the sum of code number 180, 181 and 182. And the independent variables in our case are the individual demographics and the monthly consumption expenditure and land size. So these individual and the household characteristics range from a host of factors like age, gender, sector, caste, marital status, employment type, literacy, nature of dwelling, among others. Now, if we talk about the descriptive statistics from our time use survey, we would find that there's a gender gap in the commutation pattern. If we talk about the age group, where we find that the people belonging to this age group of 25 to 64 years span, there's a high gender gap in this category when people range between 25 to 64. Now, if we talk about the marital status, we would find that the gender gap is the highest among the currently married individuals, and the lowest in case of divorce is separated. Moreover, among the male gender, we would find that the currently married males spend more time on commutation than their other counterparts. Now, among females also, we find that the divorced and the separated spend the highest time on commutation, which might be on account which the literature has hold true to. And among the transgenders also, we find that the widows spend the highest time on commutation for work. Now, if we talk about the education status and the commutation pattern, we find that as the education level increases, the commutation time for work also rises for both male and females. Now, if on the basis of the nature of dwelling, we find that the males who reside in the Pakka house spend the highest time on commutation for work, and which might be on account of better housing and better jobs, prompting them to afford longer work trips. Moreover, among females, we find that both from Kacha and Pakka house, women spend 71 minutes on an average on commutation for work. So these numbers are the average time spent by a person on commutation for work, and stands 71 minutes for women who reside in Kacha houses.
Sila?
Now, among rural and urban areas, we do find that males and females staying in urban areas spend more time than their urban counterparts commutation for employment. Now,
if you could just last 1 minute and start winding down.
Okay, sure. Now so I'd be moving to the regression results now. So these are the results from regression. We find that females on an average spend statistically significant less, 12 minutes less than their male counterparts on commutation for work. Moreover, we also find that we do not find the statistically significant difference in the urban and the rural counterparts when it comes to commutation. We also find that employers spend more time, 5 minutes more on commutation for work than their other counterparts, which is intriguing in context. Moreover, the married spend 2 minutes more on commutation for work. And when we consider the head of the family, when we consider the status of the person as head of the family, we do not find any statistically significant results there. We also find that the people belonging to the upper caste spend 2 minutes more on commutation for work. Furthermore, as the income of the family increases, the time spent on commutation for work also shoots up. And the marital status and the female who are currently married spend relatively 2 minutes less on commutation for work. So we find the marriage penalty acting as a barrier for women for commutation for work. Moreover, we also find that females who belong to an economically well-off family spend relatively more time on commutation for work. We have also considered two subsamples of adult males and females where we find similar kind of findings from the previous tables. The same holds true here, where irrespective of the marital status we find that females spend less time on commutation for work. And head of the family, here we find that head of the family in an unmarried category spends 6 minutes less on commutation for work. We do not find any role of region. We do not find the role of nature of dwelling in this case. Moreover, the role of economic well-being in the commutation for work holds true irrespective of the marital status we considered. So the conclusion from our study is that on average, there is a gendered phenomena in India's commutation time for work. We also find that marriage penalty acts as a barrier for women's commute for work. Following the findings of Yadav et al., that concluded that commutation is prevalent in socially better off state. In this context, we find that caste-based network does follow, and housing infrastructure has a negative association with the commutation time, where people staying in Pakka and semi-Pakka house spending less time on the commutation. Moreover, urban areas still matter for women, favoring them to spend more time commutation than their rural counterparts. Now, we find that comparing.
Is this your last slide? If you could just pick on the most important points, because you've really overshot your time.
Okay. So we suggest a frequent collection of time use data by including information on the availability of transport with the person or information on the mode of transport. The current study notes that despite the literature pointing towards a convergence in the conventional human capital factor, there still prevails gender differences in commutation time for work. So thank you so much for your patience, and yeah.
Thanks, Sila. I just have one question which you can pick up later, but I'm also wondering what is the relationship, because you talked about self-employment and also female labor force
Yeah.
participation. If less commute time also means there is an impact on the quality of work, are women choosing poorer, lesser opportunities, or are their opportunities not that great because they're trying to stay within the vicinity of the home and
Hmm.
less? And what does it also mean in terms of affordability of transport as well? Okay, so we'll pick this up later perhaps. We'll now move
Sure,
to
sure, sure.
Nony Gupta.
Thank you.
You can dive right in because we are really late.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nony Gupta, and today, and I'm from. I've just recently completed my research from Institute for Housing and Urban Development in Rotterdam, and today I'll be presenting on the topic: the role of women in adaptation to extreme water events in low developing areas, with a case study of Chitra Nagar, Chennai, India. So, when we move to the background, we know that cities are increasingly facing environmental and natural resources pressure, and this is also due to the changing climate. India is the seventh most affected country in the world due to climate change, mainly owing to extreme precipitation and consequent flooding. Moreover, in this scenario, women and children are 14 times more likely to die in a disaster as compared to men, which makes them much more vulnerable to climate related impacts. And within these facts, we see that the city as well acts as it exacerbates inequalities, and there are socio-political dynamics at play at cities itself. So, coming to the problem statement, although women are more vulnerable to climate change impacts, they also possess unique capacities as community leaders and managers of natural resources. Several studies show that women possess skills, knowledge, and unique local and traditional experience that help them in dealing with changes within their immediate environments. But they are often overlooked or sometimes unrecognized in strategies for disaster management and climate adaptation. So this could be also owing to the patriarchal dominance prevalent in most communities, but also the lack of gendered information and knowledge and awareness related to the gendered aspects within climate impacts. Here I also quote a feminist researcher that says any attempt to tackle climate change that excludes a gender analysis will be insufficient, unjust, and therefore unsustainable. So the main research question was what is the role of women in adaptation to extreme floods and water scarcity in a low-income settlement? And there are four sub-questions. The first two dealing directly with the role of women, which is first, what are the adaptive capacities? And the second, what are the adaptation behaviors in the form of strategies? The third is the factors that can help explain the degree of involvement of women in different adaptation strategies. And the fourth is in, the ways in which women's adaptive behavior can lead to overall community resilience. I would quickly go on to the scope and limitations. The main thing is that the study is limited to a local level neighborhood study, and therefore it cannot be generalized for all local low income settlements. But it has some representation value to transfer insights to other problem areas. The research also relies on self-reported adaptation behavior, so therefore it may not reflect the true actions. This was also legitimized through qualitative tools such as discussions, expert interviews, and secondary data study. And being a largely gendered study, sometimes the subject is treated as homogeneous, but in reality, it is more complex than that in urban centers, where there are class divide, religion, socioeconomic settings that add to the complexity of cities. Two main concepts that were studied for the research are adaptive capacity, which is the capacity of individuals to manage and influence their resources and risks. And the second is adaptive behavior, which is the ability to anticipate within a long-term time frame and includes shifts in behaviors and adjustments to trends. Keeping these two concepts, the framework of the research was such that the central component is the role of women, and this was captured using the adaptive capacity and adaptive behavior being a mediating variable. And there were certain determining factors such as socio-cultural dynamics, the gender roles, social status, and overall how this leads to increase in social capital and further increasing community resilience. So when we look at the research strategy, the main approach was a case study method, and it was mainly a qualitative analysis using Atlas TI based on the operationalization of key concepts, the variables, and the indicators against all of them. Now we move on to the case study. This Chitra Nagar is located in Chennai, and it's basically a low-income slum resettlement site which houses about 10,000 people. It's situated on the inner banks of Adya River, and that's why it's naturally prone. And it was also one of the hardest hit areas during the December 2015 floods. And like any other low-income settlement in a metropolitan setting, it has its own issues such as limited access to potable water, poor solid waste management, and lack of access to sanitation facilities. Now we move on to the main results and findings. The first is the adaptive capacity, where we see that there was a high population of older women that are likely to suffer due to health and mobility limitations during floods. When we look at the employment status, we see that about half the women are reliant on unsteady and informal sort of jobs, which further reduce their adaptive capacities. Looking at housing conditions, there are about 70% people who live in the ground floor, which again reduces their capacity to deal with floods on the onset. And when we look at the adaptation strategies for floods, there were there was a lot of involvement of women during and after floods occur. And the lack of involvement before floods is because there was a lack of communication, awareness, and early warning systems that inhibited their capacity to act before. Facilitating relocation activities was also a big part of how women dealt with changes. And there was low involvement in establishing contacts with other organizations as compared to after flooding. And when we move on to after floods, women are actively involved in rebuilding their living spaces, but they have a low participation in creation of self-help groups that can increase their financial support. Next, we move on to the adaptation strategies for water scarcity, which are divided into responsive and preventive measures. Here we see a high degree of participation in response measures because women are seen to be strongly responsible for household works, and they have to they have traditional gender roles of provision of water, and therefore they see a greater sense of accountability towards water shortage issues. When it comes to physical interventions, there was low participation because of low decision-making powers and low participation of women overall in the community. When we move on to the determining factors, we see that the gender roles and gender segregation were one of the key factors which played out how they respond. Most women are perceived as sole caregivers and responsible for the food, so therefore this naturally made them more, they made them adapt to more water scarcity issues. And there was almost little to no participation of women in decision making and lobbying support from outside organizations. There were certain other factors that included local governance, quality of physical and social infrastructure, and the service provision within the community, which further acted out how they would adapt with extreme floods and water scarcity. Now, when we look at the contribution to community resilience, we see that the presence of a substantial existing social network acted as a key contributor to the social capital of the community. There were shared experiences with extreme events in the past, which helped them, which helped with a positive influence on the community cohesion and further built on the resiliency of the community. In the end, the conclusion of the study is that women are strongly involved in during and after the flooding events, and this is mainly in safekeeping of essentials, relocating children, and rebuilding living spaces. And they have good networking and communication skills at the community level. They play a key role in management of water resources that basically helps them as roles of educators and regulators of resource usage. Because of the traditional gender roles, they also see themselves as highly accountable to deal with water scarcity issues. And there is also an active contribution to social capital of the community through their networking and natural networking skills. Lastly, the key takeaways are that the findings from the research can actually help formulate gender-sensitive adaptation strategies and frameworks and contribute to the knowledge of gendered aspects of climate change and disaster response. Also, having a clear understanding of women's roles at community and neighborhood level can formulate community leadership, capacity building, and skills workshops that can help combat water-related disasters and risks. And the central theme of the research was also that addressing gender issues such as inequality and segregation within the climate change and environment context is much needed, especially when things are constantly evolving and keeping in mind the transitionary nature of urbanization in Indian cities. And lastly, recognition of women as agents of change within climate-induced disparities can provide an opportunity for inclusive resiliency and building climate resilient communities in the long run.
Thank you so much. I think the commonality between your paper and Meghal's paper is that of looking at how any kind of crisis sort of impacts women and the gender nature of the crisis. But I'm just sort of curious, about the feminist literature which talks about the burden of managing and coping that is often left to women. So when you use the language of agents of change, how much of that burden of sort of tiding through the crisis then falls on the women? And though we are talking about household resilience, it's in fact the women who are having to cope through this crisis. So if both of you can reflect on that in the Q&A section. We'll now move on to Soundarya's presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Soundarya. I teach at RV University. This is joint work with Nitya Rao from the University of East Anglia. This is also work that I had carried out as a postdoc at IIHS, say about 4 or 5 years ago. So I'm looking forward to comments from the audience here. Our paper is titled Inclusion or Exclusion, Gendered Strategies of Migrants in Informal Settlements in Bangalore. I'll run you through a brief background, some key concepts that we use in the paper, social exclusion and agency, the context of Bangalore itself and the methods that we have employed. We look at the results in along these three categories: resources, relationships, and rights, and the conclusions. So as you all know, this is of course very common knowledge that internal migration has contributed largely to urbanization. 55% of the world's population resides in urban areas in 2018, and this is only going to go up with time. In the Indian context, of course, you have two sides of the story. On the rural side, you have agrarian distress, and in cities, you have urban precarity, and much of this was actually unraveled during the COVID pandemic when large numbers of migrants were seen walking back to their homes. So what we do see in India largely is, and the numbers are, of course, this is very difficult to capture through surveys, that you see that circular migration is a very common phenomenon. This also reflects the inequality, urban inequality in Indian cities, and we've had people in the previous panel actually talk about this quite a bit. You see many manifestations of social exclusion, one of which is residential segregation, and there's a lot of very great work which is being done both in Bangalore's context as well as in the context of other cities. There is also lack of intergenerational occupational mobility. So people have studied, Anirudh Krishna, for instance, has looked at how people who are born in slums, they end up having only a smaller range of occupational, kind of capacities, even the next generation. So there's very little occupational mobility. So given this context, we are trying to ask the question, how do migrants exercise agency? What are their strategies for inclusion in the city? The concepts that we use are, of course, the concept of social exclusion itself, which has been defined in the European context. It's the process through which individuals or groups are wholly or partially excluded from full participation in the society in which they live. There's a lot of research on social exclusion, and the key determinants of social exclusion have one of the frameworks that is there and which we use is that of rights, resources, and relationships, which determine the processes that cause deprivation. We are also looking at relationships using a gender lens. So relationality is understood using the gender analytic approach. So we are not only looking at who is excluding somebody, but also how do the excluded engage with their marginality, right? So here there's an emphasis on agencies, which is typically missing in structuralist approaches. Again, to look at agency, we're drawing on Nela Kabir's work to look at the agency as the ability to make meaningful choices and decisions, and this may include deception, manipulation, all kinds of negotiations. Resources are not only material resources, but also social resources. So social networks also become a way of looking at resources, which also provide the potential for enhanced agency. The context of Bangalore, I'll just very quickly run through this. Of course, you've had the public sector phase. There have been 3 broad phases of growth in Bangalore following independence. The public sector phase from the 1940s onwards, following which there was a growth of the unorganized labor force around public sector employment with the outsourcing of manufacturing, right? So the example of this is the garment sector, which spurred migration of informal workers from in and around Bangalore, and you still see this actually growing today, and you have a lot of migrant workers coming into Bangalore to work in the garment sector. The IT sector is again one of the largest kind of sectors which has been written about, but in terms of numbers, it's a very small number of workers in Bangalore. It only employs about 4 million of the 156 million urban workforce in Bangalore. The construction sector has also parallelly seen growth, and from about 1,43,000 workers to 2,15,000 workers in, say, whatever the numbers we do have from the NSSO over a decade. And many of these are labor migrants. There's also a large body of work on informal settlements in Bangalore, and many people in this building have also contributed to this body of research. There are many notified settlements and non-notified settlements, and we know from the research that this is only the tip of the iceberg as per what is defined as a notified or non-notified settlement as per the Karnataka Slum Areas Act are only the tip of the iceberg. There are many more that exist in the city. So this is part of this is a mixed methods study. We have a large survey which was conducted as part of the ASAR project, which is the adaptation at scale in semi-arid regions, which was part of the climate change team a couple of years ago that I was part of. Informal settlements were surveyed, both notified and non-notified informal settlements were surveyed across 4 growth corridors, partly also to look at the growth corridors were chosen because we were keen on looking at migration, right, as one of the key kind of strategies, also to look at low-lying areas in the city where migrants would come in. The methods so this is a survey of 1,109 households in 31 informal settlements, of which 11 are notified settlements. This was conducted in 2016 as part of the ASAR project at IIHS. I supplemented this with 20 semi-structured interviews in one notified settlement in North Bangalore with a variety of different kinds of migrants. We have defined them as recent migrants, older migrants, and non-migrants. This was done in 2017-18. There were a few more kinds of methods that we used. We did key informant interviews with organizations which were working with migrants in Bangalore, as well as observed meetings of unions and public meetings in the city. The survey was analyzed using SPSS, and the qualitative interviews were both hand-coded as well as RQDA was used to code. So I'm just showing you a snapshot of some results from our study along the lines of resources, relationships, and rights. So if you look at the households with key, now the way we define recent migrants, older migrants, and non-migrants was to look at the time point at which they came into the city. Recent migrants were those who have spent only about 6 years in the city at the most. Older migrants are those who have been here longer than 7 years and more. Non-migrants were those who answered, who are born and brought up in Bangalore and who live in informal settlements, and who answered no to the question on if they were a migrant. If you look at the provisioning of key amenities, you can see that recent migrants on all counts, whether it's electricity, LPG, drinking water, or any other access to toilets, they are much less provisioned in terms of key resources. In terms of their social resources as well, so the kinds of social networks that they have, again, here you see that recent migrants have spent much less time in the city to actually have built their social networks. So we're able to see that coming up in the survey. One of the things that we looked at was the ways in which language was used as a inclusion strategy. So in the first All Karnataka Bengali Migrant Workers Conference that I was lucky to participate in East Bangalore in the city. And this was a conference that took place after there was a murder of a migrant worker in that particular settlement. The conversation around language was very it came out very clearly because there were Bengali migrant workers, many of them mistaken as Bangladeshi migrant workers as well. One of the things that came up and activists kept saying was that maybe learning Kannada is a way of actually getting included into the city, speaking the local language. So we see this even in the 20 interviews that I've done in one of the informal settlements in North Bangalore. One of the workers who had worked for 11 years as a helper said that he learned Kannada on the job, even though not educated beyond the 4th standard, but he managed to learn Kannada over a period of time. And here we see that women, particularly those women who are in caregiving roles and who are recent migrants, do not actually use linguistic inclusion as a strategy of inclusion in the city. Going ahead to relationships, what we've done in our paper is to look at relationships across household and communities, so across scales. One of the strategies of inclusion that we identify is that of marriage. Marriage into households that have been living in Bangalore is seen as a strategy of inclusion. So those who have long-term residence, and I have interviews with women who have migrated from other districts such as Kolar, and this is something that comes up in my rural fieldwork as well from my PhD and from other projects, that a lot of rural women do not want to marry into the village anymore. So this is, you'll see this in a lot of marriage studies as well. People are looking for a leg into the city, and marriage is used as a strategy to come to the city. We see that as well in our work here in Bangalore. It's very interesting that marriage is also a way of enabling access to title deeds. So one of our respondents, Revati, said, since my mother-in-law has been staying for a long time in this place, we've been able to get our rights. If someone has come recently, they cannot stake claim to a place. Right? And we go on to other strategies such as how labor contractors enable migration into the city, as well as political actors and social workers. And here again, the role of women to enable women party workers, to enable college admissions for their members of their constituency, is again a kind of an extension of the role of the women within the household. So to enable social reproduction of the household, also you see that women party workers do the same within the settlement itself. I'm not going to go into it in detail because we don't have much time. On the last aspect of rights, we look at state social protection, as well as, this is a quote from one of our respondents who is a social activist with the Dalit Sangharsh Samiti. She says that we have submitted an application for houses under 94cc. This is a government directive. We have to take a title deed through this. In this manner, we have got things done one by one, be it the water bill, the light bill, everything we have got done through the Dalit Sangharsh Samiti. So access to membership of activist organizations, which also enables inclusion into the city. State social protection is another very important way in which migrants access several resources. Here we have the interview with the Anganwadi worker in the settlement, where she says that so she talks about very recent migrants who live in tarpaulin sheets, who come into even a notified settlement where there are pakka houses, but who might be there for very short time. So those who are there earlier are not there now. People who are staying now will not be there after 2 months. We won't know where they're going, when they leave the place. It's very difficult to access women also because they do not have access to phones. So it's typically the husband who would have a mobile phone as well. So this is, for instance, a photograph of some of the houses in the notified settlement. You can see the same reflect in the access to various schemes, from the PDS to midday meal scheme to ICDS. Across the board, you see that recent migrants are actually have much less access than any other categories of migrants in the city. So very broadly, our conclusions are that, as expected, recent migrants are the most disadvantaged when it comes to inclusion in the city. Inclusion is we can look at inclusion as a function of resources rights and access to resources rights and relationships. And when you look at each of these factors, you see that recent migrants are at a disadvantage. The state plays a role through the ways in which it disperses resources, and we are trying to actually unpack some of the ways in which it does this. The strategies of inclusion, as you can see, are very much place-based, and they thus favor long-term migrants and older residents in the city. So those who have actually, and the Dalit Sangharsh Samiti is one example of this, which enables, actually, if you've resided in a place for a long time, it enables you to get included into the city. So we basically try to highlight the multiple dimensions and expressions of agency in negotiating rights, resources, and relationships, some of which are individual, some of which are collective. And this, of course, going ahead with greater migration into the city with climate change and other issues is going to be quite a key issue for the growth of cities. Thank you very much.
Soundarya, I just had one question, maybe perhaps more of a reflection than a question. While you were doing your fieldwork, did you ever think about what it meant to categorize migration by reason? For example, in the literature you see that male migration is often for work, whereas female migration is mostly for marriage, even if women come to the city and finally find work. So was there any conversation around that while you were doing your fieldwork? I think the last participant is not there, was there but has dropped out. So perhaps we'll join back at some point if there's a problem at his end. Maybe we could throw this open for questions, and we'll also look at questions online. Maybe you could start with you. Could you also identify yourself and speak into the mic so that people online can hear you?
Hi, Gupta from Delhi. So one question I had for the presenter online on commutes. I don't know if she's there.
Sila, can you hear us?
Yeah.
That's a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So One thing, so I really enjoyed your paper. One thing which I was just thinking about, like which you might think about for future studies, is like, how commute relates with things like environmental pollution. Because like I'm from Delhi, it's a really polluted city. Every day when I commute to work, like so you said that commute may be linked to social betterment, but it in fact, for me, it causes a lot of physical harm. Despite being from a privileged background, I can do the commute. We have a good public transport metro system, but it makes me really unwell and it makes all my co-workers unwell. So that's one thing. And then also, to link it with harassment of women, because like yesterday was my first day in Bangalore and I was immediately flashed on the street, which was like, I had been told that Bangalore is safer, South India is safer. But on the main road in Halsuru, near Halsuru Lake, I was flashed on the main road and chased. So it's like, how does do things like commute, because now I'm scared. Now I feel like, how am I going to go and explore more restaurants in Bangalore because this has happened? So then women become very vigilant. I mean, these two things can be connected. And one thing, in gender, you did make a very interesting comparison between men and women. But when it comes to the trans people in Kacha houses, I saw that your data indicated that there was a large gap, there was a way longer commute for trans people. So could you possibly shed some light on why that could be? And maybe as like later, maybe in the chat box, you could just let us know what B0, B1 and B2 were in your formula. Because I got the variables, but I didn't understand the formula properly. And yes, and then just on the paper on migrants just presented, women are less likely to be to go for linguistic inclusion. And I got that point, but could you again explain a bit more on why that is?
Perhaps you could take a few more questions and then.
Can I?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Hi, thanks. So I have a question for Soundarya.
Tell us your name. And
sorry. Yeah, my name is Rohit. I'm from Mumbai, working as a consultant to the government. So my question actually to Soundarya was that I was very interested in how you define recent versus old. Like, how did you come up with 6 years? I mean, I'm sure it's subjective, at least unless I haven't read research on this. So how do you come up with the number 6? And then also, how do you define recent? Because a recent migrant shifting from East Bangalore to West Bangalore is a recent migrant in a West Bangalore community as compared to East Bangalore community. As compared to someone who shifted from Mumbai to Bangalore, that's also recent. So within recent also there are classifications. Why I ask this question is also because that completely changes the dynamics in which we look at the conclusions, inferences, right? For example, you talked about Dalit Sangharsh Samiti, how they are focusing on the mobilization of title deeds, which is much more quote unquote easier for older migrants as compared to recent migrants. But then what if the migrant is staying in Bangalore for 10 years, but then has been staying in or moving around 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years? So isn't that, how does that kind of play out in the politics of that NGO to choose one over another or prefer older over recent? So I'm trying to just understand that, if you can speak.
Soundarya, since there are a couple of questions, if you want to respond, and then we'll go to the other.
So let me start from the end. So we do, the choice of 6 years is actually partly from what we have gleaned from the survey as well as from the fieldwork itself. It appears, and I might be wrong on this actually, IIHS researchers will have a better hang about this. It seems that it takes up something between 2 to 5 years to be able to access very basic amenities, so access to electricity, drinking water, or few sets of amenities. And I think the literature does say more about this. I haven't gone very deep into it. So we it was an arbitrary cutoff. We put a time point of 6 years, and we we are looking at cross tabulations. We're just looking at what is the percentage of households which have access to certain amenities if they have lived in Bangalore for 6 years and versus those who have lived for longer. So it is in a way, it is an arbitrary division. Also, it helped us kind of take a cross section of our data so that we had enough numbers of people under recent migrants and older migrants. And it seemed to me, even from the fieldwork, that it takes around this amount of time to actually be able to find a leg in the city. Now, movement within Bangalore is actually a very important thing, and we do see that in the section on the role of labor contractors, we do see that people keep moving within. So someone may have come from Yadgir in Gulbarga with, a couple has come to Bangalore, and then they have moved around to several settlements within the city, and that happens through work because of the kind of opportunities, especially when it comes to the construction sector, actually. So they move to the sites, right? So that is a very important thing, and therefore, I think both time and place, and that's what we finally conclude, that of course length of time is very important, but also most strategies of inclusion seem to be place-based because, and this ends up coming up in the policy debates, right? You do see that having the one nation, one ration scheme is also a way of kind of unsettling this notion of the fact that people are located in one place all through their lifetime. So movement within Bangalore does take place, and what we are looking at is those who have moved to Bangalore, and then irrespective of whether they've been moving across settlements, we sort of at that particular time point in the qualitative work, those who were in that settlement, and for the survey, of course, it's how long they have spent in Bangalore. On linguistic inclusion, I think this is to do actually with work. So if you are employed, you have more opportunities to actually pick up the language, and even domestic workers actually do pick up the local language, even if they're not acquainted to it. And we do see that. But yeah, we do see that, yeah, it is. So the male migrants in our sample tend to learn Kannada faster because they learn it on the job pretty much, and engaging with contractors and all the kind of nuts and bolts of their social network, which enable them to have a job on a daily basis, right? Your question on actually on marriage, why we did not look, rather than look at time, if we were to look at reasons for migration, that's a good question, and I think somewhere the reasons for migration do end up coming up in our analysis because marriage does seem to be a strategy for inclusion, but we didn't actually take a cross section of the data using reasons for migration. It somehow didn't seem to give us a good kind of breakup of what was going on.
Great, thank you so much. There's one question for Meghal. There's a question, I don't know who it is from, but the online question says, hello, a wonderfully thoughtful and well-rounded discussion on a critically important subject. My question is, have you given some thought to what the critical needs are in terms of addressing this crisis in food and cooking? And if you could also tell us a little bit about the methods. There's also a question for Nony, but I can't find it now. How do you think you can take forward your findings on increasing or encouraging the role of women in extreme weather, in extreme water events? Meghal, if you want to get started.
Yeah, sure. Just with regards to the critical needs at this point, so I think while the gas situation has calmed down a little bit, one of the key problems now that people are facing in terms of energy is the electricity tariffs, and there is also a discussion about increasing it again in January, even though we had a 75% increase in August. So I think a critical need is preventing that from happening. There's also other things like the forgiveness of electricity arrears, which happened during COVID, which I think would really benefit. But the main issues are the high cost of living and really high food inflation. And so until those issues are addressed, either through some comprehensive social protection scheme, cash transfers is usually what is suggested, but it needs to be an approach that addresses hunger and nutrition as much as it does just poverty in general, so that a more expanded social protection scheme is necessary at this time, I think. With regards to the methods question, I think we basically started our research as fieldwork as the crisis kicked off, and it was kicking off with these gas explosions. So it was a very interesting moment to start your research. And as a result, we saw different iterations of the crisis over the next 8 months. But in terms of doing research during a crisis point where food is so expensive, and remember that this project is about food security and infrastructure access. And the ethics of really asking people about their eating patterns really came up. We actually, there was a component that involved food plate photography in the initial plan. And we actually didn't go ahead with that because it's really not ethical at this point to ask people, to ask this kind of information from people. So those were some of the methodological concerns or issues we had.
Okay, thank you for that.
So the question was, I think, how do we increase the role of women in extreme water events? I think the answer lies within the problem itself. First of all, to exclude women is, it's more of a homogeneous thing. It impacts the community in general when we look at the role of women. So the problem that I see in the case study was that there was a lack of platform for participation or community building. And if that can be done, then the issues that women face on day-to-day lives and also the strategies and the coping mechanisms they use can be dealt with in more from a structural point of view, and how it can inform the local governance, and it can actually lead actions of the government with some focus from what we understand from the role of women. So I think to look at it as more of a heterogeneous nature and not just focus, just to recognize that there are these issues and there are certain hidden capacities, and to sort of take it forward on a more on a community level platform would be useful.
Okay, thank you. Sila, there was a question for you if you want to get to that.
Yeah, thank you. So, first of all, I'm extremely sorry for your experience in Bangalore, and it is really unfortunate if it happens in a city like that, or anywhere in the country, or anywhere in the country. And going to your first question on how commute relates to the environment and the climate change, and relating that to my commutation thing. So there are studies, and in Indian context, I might look at that in the future as an extension of this paper. Moreover, talking about the sexual harassment, I can look at the incidences of sexual harassment and their impact on commutation time in India's context. Moreover, as you pointed out, the transgenders commute. It is quite a good observation from your end that you did find that gap in transgenders commute. I also find that the scarcity and the precarity of the transgenders employment in India's context is a matter here, and the nature of the employment they are engaged in, and the availability of the jobs for transgenders. So that is actually that might be a probable reason for their for the low commute or the widened commutation gap. Moreover, your question on equation, so that's basically a regression equation where on the left hand side you have the dependent variable, and betas are the coefficients which show the average increase in the average change in the dependent variable with a slight change in the independent variable. So those beta coefficients are basically the slope or the average change. So yeah, thank you for your question. I forgot the name of the audience, the person who asked this question. So yeah, thank you.
Sila. Are there any other questions? This is a rare event at a conference that we would end before the break. Okay, so if no questions, we have 15 minutes extra in the break perhaps. So, thank you everybody. Thank you so much for your patience and listening.